Hey, what's going on everyone? This is just a quick video that is just going to be me sharing my personal opinion on post-game DLC. I'll be using Elden Ring's DLC as a reference for this topic, now that I've had the chance to play it for a bit more. As such, the video playing in the background will be my latest Remembrance boss fights, and apologies ahead of time if parts of the fights get cut. My PS4 likes to cut content all of a sudden without notice. But just as a heads up, I still haven't beaten the DLC, but have had a good chance to explore what I could as of this video. I'll definitely keep playing the DLC on my end, but this is my personal opinion of what I've seen with today's DLC content for these types of games. I know one of the main topics that's being mentioned about Elden Ring's DLC is that it's too hard, and I will say that it's definitely harder than the base game, but that should come to no surprise to anyone who's familiar with From Software's post-game content. I've played the entire Souls Trilogy DLC and Bloodborne's DLC, so I did expect that it was going to be difficult, but still beatable with trial and error. This DLC definitely got a lot more attention since Elden Ring did manage to bring in a lot of newcomers into this genre, and I'm saying this since I do have different people I know from my end that Elden Ring was their first FromSoft experience. But there have been other games that aren't related to FromSoft that have also done their DLC harder than the base game. Some of those examples would be Cuphead and the first Marvel Spider-Man. Yep, their DLC was definitely harder than the base game, but why is that the case? From what I see, when developers are creating any DLC after the game's initial release, they already have a plan as to what they are wanting to do. In the case of Cuphead's DLC, the developers already expected the player to know how to play the game, or at the very least, have beaten it for the first time. Hence why when their DLC was released, it was seen that the difficulty was of what you would expect when reaching the final levels of the game, since at this point, you as the player should already know how to play and is already prepared for another challenge. This was also the case with the first Marvel Spider-Man game. The DLC was already being established to the player to have the same difficulty of what you were facing in the final acts of the base game. Although not on the same difficulty level as FromSoft, it still amped up its difficulty from the base game in the first mission when booting up the DLC. One way that I see how these games' DLCs were created would be when someone who's been drawing for a while compares what their art was when they first started to what it looks right now. They are essentially going to keep drawing at the level they currently are at the moment and add more to it to improve upon it even more. If you as a player were expecting your designated game's DLC to not give you any type of challenge, whether it be by different enemies, added difficulty, or anything that could be considered fresh, you would essentially get bored of it extremely quickly, since nothing from the base game would have changed. Which brings me to my next topic of discussion, player skill. Now, in my opinion, player skill is something that's ultimately going to be different for each individual. Some can adapt to changing situations much quicker than others, while others can stick to one playstyle the entire time and not want to change it for a different situation. This was something that was clearly seen with Elden Ring's DLC, some mentioning that the tactics they used in the base game didn't necessarily work when first attempting the DLC. This is where, from what I see, developers take any information that was received from the player base in regards to what were the most common tactics used by the majority. With this information, game developers can adapt their DLC to either go with the current player tactics or have them changed so the player can create a new playstyle and explore new options. This is where player skill comes into play, as there are many occasions in which developers create their DLCs to scale with the player's current stats to give them a challenge and see if their tactics were a part of their skill level or only dependent on luck and overpowering everything. A lot of feedback can be given by some players that the DLC they purchased can seem unfair on their end. Believe me, this happened in the first weeks of Cuphead's DLC. It's no different to what Elden Ring's DLC is currently going at the time. There will definitely be builds that players create to absolutely make the DLC a breeze after some time has passed. But for the earliest stages of it, all players are essentially learning it. I can share a personal experience of mine when I first booted up Cuphead's DLC. I'll admit, I struggled with some parts of it when going against the new bosses, and a little more when going against them in expert difficulty. This was mostly due to the DLC being something brand new to me, and me not having any prior knowledge of it, other than knowing that the difficulty was going to be similar to the last isle of the base game. This challenged my personal player skill to learn the new boss patterns, alongside any new weapons that also came with the DLC. This was in my first playthrough of it. Once I came back to it in a second playthrough, everything became much easier to complete, due to me already having experienced the initial struggle in my first playthrough. One thing I do recall doing with both Cuphead's DLC and my last attempt with Rayana's fight was switching up my gear after going through some trial and error. This was after I had already seen all the attacks they could possibly do and work my way around that with different equipment to better suit the situation. This is something I do see with many players lately, in which the equipment that worked for a majority of the time isn't necessarily the most effective against what you're facing right now. Believe me, this is something that I struggle with as well, since I had the thought that, well, what I currently have has worked this whole time. Why wouldn't it work in this situation as well? Combining both different equipment and what you currently know about what you're facing really goes a long way. There are two games that I do think will cause some kind of debate online in the future if and when they decide to release DLC content, those being Lies of P and Stellar Blade. For anyone who's already played these two games, you can probably expect their DLCs to have the same difficulty as the last hour of their main campaign. Anyways, that's all I wanted to mention in this quick video. If there's still part of the Rayana fight going, I'll keep it playing until the end. See ya!